The realization arrives on an ordinary Tuesday morning. You don't see it coming. You're 42 years old, sitting in your car in the company parking lot, staring at the concrete building where you've worked for the past 15 years. Maybe it's the fluorescent lights visible through the windows that suddenly feel like prison bars. Maybe it's the email notification on your phone about the quarterly targets you'll spend the next 3 months chasing. Or maybe it's just the crushing weight of another day that will feel exactly like yesterday, and tomorrow and every day stretching infinitely forward into a future you can't escape. And without warning, something ancient and terrified awakens in your chest. If I don't break free from this, I'll disappear completely into a life I never actually chose. This is what Max Weber called the iron cage of rationality. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Weber, the German sociologist writing at the turn of the 20th century, observed something that would become one of the most prophetic diagnoses of modern existence. He watched as Western civilization built a prison so sophisticated, so efficient, so perfectly designed that its inhabitants would mistake their confinement for freedom, their chains for career paths, their slow suffocation for success. The iron cage is not made of metal. It's constructed from spreadsheets and productivity metrics, from organizational hierarchies and standardized procedures, from the relentless rationalization of every aspect of human life until nothing sacred remains. And the most terrifying part is this. You helped build your own cage bar by bar, believing each addition would bring you closer to meaning when it was actually sealing you further from it. Weber understood that modernity would bring unprecedented material prosperity, technological advancement, and organizational efficiency. But he also saw that these gains would come at a cost that few were willing to acknowledge. The same rationalization that freed humanity from superstition and scarcity would also strip existence of enchantment, purpose, and transcendence. We would become, in his words, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, caught in a mechanism we created but can no longer control. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. Those are Weber's own words, and they cut deep because they describe not some dystopian future but the reality you're living right now. The iron cage is the modern condition, and if you've ever felt that your life is running on autopilot, that you're going through motions that someone else programmed, that you're succeeding by every external measure while dying by every internal one, then you already know exactly what Weber was warning us about. The cage reveals itself in stages. At first, you don't recognize it as confinement because it's presented as opportunity. You enter the education system, and it seems like preparation for life. You accept your first job, and it feels like the beginning of your career. You climb the ladder, and it looks like progress. You optimize your schedule, and it appears to be productivity. You measure your worth through metrics and KPIs, and it masquerades as objectivity. But somewhere along the way, the tools become the master. The systems you adopted to serve your goals become the goals themselves. The means eclipse the ends. And you wake up one day realizing that you're no longer living your life but managing it, no longer pursuing meaning but processing tasks, no longer becoming who you're meant to be, but fulfilling a role that was designed by forces you've never questioned. Weber identified this as the fundamental transformation of modernity. We shifted from value rationality to instrumental rationality. Value rationality, which Weber called Wertrationalität, means acting according to what you believe is intrinsically right, meaningful, or sacred, regardless of whether it's efficient or profitable. Instrumental rationality, or Zweckrationalität, means selecting the most efficient means to achieve a given end without questioning whether that end is actually worth pursuing. The iron cage is what happens when instrumental rationality colonizes every domain of human existence. You stop asking why you're doing something and focus entirely on how to do it more efficiently. You stop questioning whether your work matters and concentrate on whether you're meeting your targets. You stop reflecting on what kind of person you're becoming and obsess over what kind of professional you're projecting. The cage doesn't lock you in through force. It locks you in through the seductive promise that if you just optimize a little more, measure a little better, rationalize a little further, you'll finally arrive at the fulfillment that keeps receding just beyond your grasp. Here resides a paradox that Weber understood with painful clarity. The same rationalization that makes modern life possible also makes meaningful life nearly impossible. The bureaucratic structures that coordinate millions of people to produce goods, deliver services, and maintain social order are the same structures that reduce individuals to interchangeable parts in a vast machine. The economic systems that generate unprecedented wealth are the same systems that measure human worth through productivity metrics. The technological innovations that connect us across continents are the same innovations that fragment our attention into monetizable microseconds. You cannot simply reject rationalization and return to some pre-modern paradise because that world is gone, and it was far from paradisical. But you also cannot surrender completely to rationalization without losing the essence of what makes you human. You're caught between two impossibilities. You need the cage to survive in the modern world, but the cage is also slowly suffocating everything that makes survival worthwhile. Consider how this manifests in your actual daily experience. You wake up not to your body's natural rhythms, but to an alarm calibrated to maximize your productive hours. You eat breakfast not because you're hungry, but because nutritional science says it optimizes cognitive performance. You commute not through space you experience, but through time you're trying to minimize. You arrive at work where your value is quantified through metrics that measure everything except what actually matters. You attend meetings that exist primarily to justify other meetings. You generate reports that no one reads to satisfy processes that no one remembers creating. You check boxes on performance reviews that reduce your complexity to a 5-point scale. You receive compensation that's carefully calculated to keep you productive but not powerful. You return home where you manage your relationships like projects, schedule quality time with your children, and track your self-care routine on apps designed to monetize your anxiety about not being optimized enough. And through it all, there's a quiet voice asking the question you're terrified to fully hear. Is this really all there is? Weber saw this coming with such precision that reading him now feels less like historical study and more like reading your own psychological autopsy. In his famous lecture, Science as a Vocation, delivered in 1917, he described what he called the disenchantment of the world. The ancient peoples believed that the world was filled with spirits, meanings, and sacred forces that demanded reverence and relationship. Modernity replaced all of that with mechanism, causality, and instrumental control. The forest that once housed divinities became timber resources to be harvested efficiently. The river that once embodied spiritual power became water flow to be managed rationally. The human being who once carried a soul became human capital to be allocated optimally. This isn't just about losing religion, though that's part of it. It's about losing the capacity to experience anything as sacred, as intrinsically valuable, as worthy of reverence, rather than exploitation. The disenchanted world is a world where everything has a price, but nothing has inherent worth, where everything can be used, but nothing should be honored, where everything is a means to some other end, in an infinite regress that never arrives at anything genuinely meaningful. The iron cage doesn't announce itself with obvious cruelty. If it did, you could resist it. Instead, it seduces you with the promise of security, advancement, and belonging. It tells you that if you follow the rules, meet the standards, and optimize your performance, you'll be rewarded with success. And it delivers on that promise just enough to keep you compliant. You do get promoted. You do earn more money. You do achieve the markers of status that society holds up as proof of a life well lived. But somewhere in the process you notice that the rewards feel hollow, that the success tastes like ashes, that the approval you worked so hard to earn doesn't actually satisfy the hunger it was supposed to feed. This is because the iron cage operates through a bait and switch. It promises fulfillment through achievement but delivers only more achievement. It promises meaning through success but delivers only metrics. It promises freedom through career advancement but delivers only more sophisticated forms of control. Weber studied the origins of this cage with particular attention to what he called the Protestant ethic. In his groundbreaking work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he traced how certain religious ideas about salvation, vocation, and worldly success created the psychological conditions for modern capitalism. The early Protestants, particularly Calvinists, believed in predestination. Your eternal fate was already decided by God, and there was nothing you could do to change it. This created unbearable anxiety. How do you know if you're saved or damned? The solution they developed was to look for signs of election in worldly success. If you were prosperous, disciplined, and productive, that was evidence that God had chosen you. This created what Weber called an inner-worldly asceticism. Instead of withdrawing from the world to seek spiritual perfection, you threw yourself into worldly work with religious intensity, treating your professional success as a sign of divine favor. You worked not for pleasure or mere survival, but as a calling, a vocation that demonstrated your worth before God. But here's where the tragedy unfolds. Over time, the religious framework that gave this work ethic its meaning eroded away. God died, as Nietzsche declared, but the work ethic survived. We kept the relentless productivity, the guilt about rest, the equation of human worth with economic output. But we lost the transcendent framework that once justified it. What remained was work without purpose, striving without salvation, productivity as an end in itself, rather than a means to something sacred. This is the iron cage in its purest form. You're still working with religious intensity, still measuring your worth through achievement, still feeling guilty when you're not productive, but there's no heaven waiting at the end of it. There's just more work, more metrics, more optimization, stretching forward into an infinity that promises nothing except the continuation of itself. As you listen to this, ask yourself which parts of your life are governed by value rationality and which by instrumental rationality. When was the last time you did something simply because it felt sacred, meaningful, or intrinsically right, regardless of whether it was efficient or productive? When was the last time you made a decision based on who you want to become, rather than what you want to achieve? When was the last time you experienced your work as a genuine vocation, a calling that emerges from your deepest being, rather than a role you're performing to meet external expectations? For most people trapped in the iron cage, these questions produce painful silence because instrumental rationality has colonized everything. There's no space left that hasn't been rationalized, optimized, and subordinated to some calculable end. The cage manifests differently for different people, but Weber identified patterns that remain eerily relevant. For some, the iron cage appears as the corporate ladder that you climb with increasing desperation, believing that the next promotion will finally deliver the satisfaction that every previous one failed to provide. You sacrifice relationships, health, and authenticity in service of advancement, only to discover that each new level of success reveals another level above it, and the hunger never abates. For others, the cage appears as the tyranny of choice in a market economy. You're free to choose between infinite consumer options, but you're never free to step outside the role of consumer. You can customize your prison but not escape it. You can pick your preferred brand of meaninglessness, but not opt out of meaninglessness itself. For still others, the cage appears as the productivity culture that turns every moment into an opportunity for optimization. Rest becomes recovery for future performance. Relationships become networking opportunities. Hobbies become side hustles. Nothing is allowed to simply be. Everything must justify itself through its contribution to some measurable outcome. Weber saw that the iron cage would produce a specific type of human being, the specialist without spirit, as he called them. Are people with tremendous technical competence in narrow domains but no broader sense of purpose, meaning, or connection to anything transcendent. They can optimize processes with extraordinary efficiency, but they cannot tell you why those processes are worth optimizing. They can climb organizational hierarchies with impressive skill, but they cannot articulate what they're climbing toward. They can generate wealth, produce outputs, and manage systems, but they've lost touch with the question of what makes life worth living. And the sensualists without heart are those who, recognizing the emptiness of instrumental rationality, try to fill the void with pleasure, consumption, and distraction. They chase experiences, accumulate possessions, and curate lifestyles. But it's all surface, all performance, all desperate attempts to feel something in a world that's been stripped of genuine feeling. Here resides another paradox. The iron cage creates both workaholics and hedonists, and often these are the same person at different moments. You throw yourself into work with desperate intensity, trying to find meaning and achievement, and when that fails, you throw yourself into consumption, travel, or entertainment with equally desperate intensity, trying to find meaning in experience. But both strategies fail because they're both operating within the logic of the cage. They're both forms of instrumental rationality, Work becomes a means to wealth. Wealth becomes a means to consumption. Consumption becomes a means to fleeting pleasure. Pleasure becomes a means to temporary distraction from the emptiness. And the emptiness remains because you never stepped outside the system to ask what you actually value, what you actually believe is sacred, what kind of person you actually want to become. The experience of the iron cage often intensifies during what Weber would call moments of reckoning. These are the times when the machinery stutters, when the rationalized systems fail to deliver what they promised, when you can no longer avoid the questions you've been suppressing. Maybe it's a health crisis that forces you to confront your mortality. Maybe it's a relationship breakdown that reveals how disconnected you've become from genuine intimacy. Maybe it's a professional failure that shatters the illusion that achievement equals worth. Maybe it's simply reaching a milestone, turning 40 or 50, and realizing that you've been so busy climbing ladders that you never stopped to ask if they were leaning against the right walls. These moments are terrifying because they threaten the entire structure of meaning you've built. If you're not your job title, your salary, your productivity metrics, then who are you? If you're not pursuing the next goal, earning the next promotion, optimizing the next process, then what are you doing? The iron cage protects you from these questions by keeping you too busy to ask them. But when the protection fails, you're left naked before the void. Weber understood that different people respond to the cage in fundamentally different ways, and this brings us to what he identified as types of authority and legitimacy. Some people never see the cage. They're so completely absorbed into the rationalized system that they experience their confinement as freedom. They genuinely believe that their worth is their productivity, that their identity is their professional role, that the meaning of life is achievement within the existing structures. They're not pretending or lying to themselves. They've internalized the logic of the cage so completely that they cannot imagine any alternative. These are often the most successful people by conventional measures because they experience no friction between who they are and what the system demands. But Weber would say they've achieved success through what he called the disenchantment of their own souls. They function perfectly within the machine because they've become machines themselves. Others see the cage but feel powerless to escape it. They recognize the emptiness of instrumental rationality. They know their work is meaningless. They sense that they're living someone else's life, but they cannot imagine a viable alternative. They have bills to pay, families to support, identities built around their professional roles. The thought of stepping outside the cage induces existential terror. What would they do? Who would they be? How would they survive? So they stay, increasingly bitter, increasingly resentful, increasingly numb, going through motions they despise while fantasizing about escape they'll never attempt. Weber would call this resentment without transformation, the recognition of imprisonment without the courage to seek freedom. Still others respond to the cage with what Weber might call charismatic rebellion. They recognize the iron cage and refuse to accept it as inevitable. They step outside conventional career paths. They reject the equation of human worth with economic productivity. They organize their lives around values rather than optimization. They're willing to accept material sacrifice in exchange for meaning, authenticity, and freedom. But Weber warned that charismatic rebellion faces its own dangers. Charisma, in Weber's technical sense, is authority based on extraordinary personal qualities rather than rational legal structures. Charismatic leaders and movements can break the spell of rationalization temporarily, but they struggle to sustain themselves because charisma is inherently unstable. It depends on the personal magnetism of individuals, and it tends either to fade over time or to become routinized back into the very bureaucratic structures it initially opposed. How many revolutionary movements end up creating new cages as rigid as the ones they fought against? How many people who escape corporate structures end up building entrepreneurial ventures that demand even more rationalization than traditional employment? Because the iron cage is so pervasive and so powerful, Weber believed that escape is not a simple matter of individual choice. The cage is not just in your workplace or your economic system. It's in your mind, in your habits, in your very conception of what makes life valuable. You can quit your job, move to a different country, adopt a minimalist lifestyle, and still carry the cage with you because you're still measuring your worth through metrics, still optimizing your existence, still treating life as a problem to be solved through rational calculation. The cage travels with you because it's not primarily external. It's a way of being, a mode of consciousness that modernity has inscribed so deeply into our psyche that we don't recognize it as one possibility among others. We experience it as reality itself. Yet Weber was not entirely pessimistic, though he's often read that way. He believed that awareness of the iron cage, while painful, creates the possibility of what he called inner freedom. You may not be able to escape the external structures of rationalized modernity, but you can cultivate a relationship to those structures that preserves an inner space of meaning, purpose, and authentic choosing. This is not the same as pretending the cage doesn't exist or convincing yourself that your confinement is actually freedom. It's a tragic consciousness, a recognition that you live in a disenchanted world while refusing to become disenchanted yourself. It's the ability to perform your role within rationalized systems, while maintaining awareness that you are more than your role, that your worth exceeds your productivity, that there are dimensions of existence that cannot be captured by any metric. This inner freedom requires what Weber called intellectual integrity. You must face the world as it actually is, not as you wish it to be. You cannot escape the iron cage through comforting illusions, spiritual bypassing, or nostalgic fantasies about pre-modern authenticity. The old gods are dead. The sacred canopies that once gave life meaning have been torn down by the acids of modernity. You live in a disenchanted world, and no amount of wishful thinking will re-enchant it. But intellectual integrity also means recognizing that disenchantment is a historical development, not a metaphysical necessity. The world was not always disenchanted, and it will not always remain so. The iron cage was built by human beings making specific choices shaped by specific historical conditions, which means it can potentially be transformed by human beings making different choices under different conditions. The first step toward inner freedom is recognizing the cage for what it is. This is harder than it sounds, because the cage is designed to be invisible. It presents itself as common sense, as the way things are, as practical necessity. You think you're making free choices, when in fact you're selecting from options that have already been pre-selected by systems you didn't design and don't control. Recognizing the cage means seeing that what appears to be freedom is often a choice between different forms of confinement, that what appears to be progress is often just more sophisticated rationalization, that what appears to be success is often just deeper integration into structures that diminish your humanity. This recognition is painful. It strips away the comforting illusions that make daily life bearable. It reveals that much of what you've been striving for is ultimately hollow, but it also opens a space for genuine choosing, because you can only choose freely when you see clearly what you're choosing between. The second step is distinguishing between unavoidable constraints and self-imposed prisons. Some aspects of the iron cage are genuine necessities of living in complex modern societies. You need economic systems to coordinate production and distribution. You need organizational hierarchies to manage collective action. You need some degree of rationalization to solve technical problems. But Weber saw that we consistently over-rationalize, extending instrumental logic into domains where it doesn't belong and cannot deliver what it promises. You don't need to measure your self-worth through productivity metrics. You don't need to treat every relationship as a networking opportunity. You don't need to optimize every moment of existence. These are choices, not necessities, but they've become so normalized that we experience them as inevitable. Distinguishing what's truly necessary from what's merely conventional creates space to reconstruct your life according to different principles. The third step is cultivating what Weber called value rationality in domains where it's been eclipsed by instrumental rationality. This means identifying what you actually believe is intrinsically valuable, not as a means to something else, but as worthy of reverence in itself. Maybe it's art that serves no purpose beyond beauty. Maybe it's relationships pursued for their own sake rather than their utility. Maybe it's knowledge sought from curiosity rather than career advancement. Maybe it's spiritual practice that doesn't promise measurable outcomes. Maybe it's simply being present to existence without constantly trying to improve, optimize, or instrumentalize it. Value rationality is not irrational. It's a different kind of rationality, one that asks not what's most efficient, but what's most meaningful, not what produces the best outcomes, but what honors your deepest commitments. This brings us to one of Weber's most provocative ideas. In a famous passage, he wrote that in the modern world, We must choose our gods, knowing that they will war with each other. What he meant is that there's no overarching framework, no ultimate authority, no cosmic order that tells you definitively what to value. The sacred canopies have collapsed. You're thrown back on your own choosing, and that choosing is agonizing because different values genuinely conflict. Professional success often conflicts with family intimacy. Artistic integrity often conflicts with economic security. Personal authenticity often conflicts with social belonging. You cannot maximize everything simultaneously. You must choose, and every choice involves sacrifice. The person who tries to avoid choosing, who wants to keep all options open, who refuses to commit to any particular constellation of values, ends up with nothing but the empty flexibility that the market demands. They become the perfectly adaptable worker, the ideal consumer, the ultimate specialist without spirit. But the person who chooses consciously, who says this is what I value even though it costs me that, who builds their life around commitments they know are not universal or provable or guaranteed to succeed, this person achieves something the cage cannot give them. They achieve what Weber called a personality. Not in the sense of a charming disposition, but in the deeper sense of an integrated self organized around chosen values. The personality is not given. It must be achieved through the painful work of choosing who you will be, what you will stand for, what you will sacrifice for, knowing that there's no external authority that can validate these choices. You must make them in freedom and in fear, aware that you could be wrong, that your life might not work out, that your values might prove inadequate. But this tragic choosing is the only path to meaning in a disenchanted world. Consider the historical figure of Martin Luther, whom Weber studied intensively. Luther was a monk tormented by the question of salvation. He followed every rule, performed every penance, pursued every religious practice with fanatical intensity, but he never felt certain of God's grace. The iron cage of medieval Catholicism told him that salvation came through works, through following the prescribed system, through optimizing his religious performance. But no amount of optimization delivered the certainty he craved. His breakthrough came when he recognized that salvation could not be achieved through works at all. It came through faith alone, through a direct relationship with the divine that bypassed the institutional machinery. This was a charismatic rebellion against the rationalized religious system of his time. Luther stepped outside the cage by recognizing that the cage could never deliver what it promised. But notice what happened next. Luther's rebellion eventually became institutionalized into Protestantism, which Weber argued created the psychological conditions for modern capitalism and the iron cage we now inhabit. The liberator became the architect of a new prison. This is the tragic cycle Weber saw repeating throughout history. We break one cage only to build another because we cannot imagine existence without structure, without systems, without some form of rationalization. Or consider Benjamin Franklin, whom Weber used as the prototype of the Protestant work ethic. Franklin wrote that time is money, that credit is money, that money can beget money. He created elaborate systems for tracking his virtues, measuring his improvement, optimizing his productivity. He treated his own life as a project to be managed rationally, and he succeeded spectacularly by conventional measures. He became wealthy, influential, historically significant. But Weber asked whether Franklin's life was actually meaningful or merely successful, whether his relentless rationalization brought genuine fulfillment or just more achievement. Franklin represents the specialist without spirit in its purest form. Brilliant, accomplished, productive, and yet somehow hollow at the core because his entire existence was organized around instrumental rationality. There was no space for the sacred, for the intrinsically valuable, for anything that could not justify itself through measurable outcomes. Now contrast this with someone like Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic Weber occasionally referenced. Eckhart taught that true spiritual awakening required what he called breakthrough, a radical letting go of all concepts, all certainties, all systems of meaning. He spoke of the soul's ground, a dimension of being that exists prior to and beyond all rationalization, all measurement, all instrumental purposes. Eckhart was dangerous to institutional authority, precisely because he pointed to a dimension of existence that could not be controlled, managed, or incorporated into bureaucratic systems. He embodied what Weber called value rationality in its most extreme form, His values were not means to some other end. They were absolute commitments that structured his entire existence, even when they brought him into conflict with the church. Eckhart faced potential charges of heresy because the cage cannot tolerate what it cannot rationalize. But Eckhart maintained his inner freedom even within institutional constraints because he had cultivated a relationship to the sacred that no external structure could colonize. The difference between Franklin and Eckhart illuminates the choice Weber believed modernity forces upon us. Will you organize your existence entirely around instrumental rationality, becoming ever more successful and ever more empty? Or will you cultivate domains of value rationality, preserving spaces where meaning matters more than efficiency, where being matters more than achieving, where the sacred is honored even when it cannot be measured? This is not a choice between success and failure, between practical engagement and mystical withdrawal. Eckhart was deeply engaged with the world. Franklin presumably had spiritual interests, but they represent fundamentally different orientations toward existence. Franklin lived as if instrumental rationality were the only rationality. Eckhart lived as if there were dimensions of reality that instrumental rationality cannot touch. Weber's question is which orientation will structure your life, knowing that you cannot fully escape instrumental rationality in the modern world, but you can refuse to let it colonize everything. As you reflect on your own life, where do you recognize the iron cage? Is it in your work, where you perform roles that feel increasingly disconnected from who you actually are? Is it in your relationships, where you manage connection rather than experiencing intimacy? Is it in your inner life, where you've internalized the logic of optimization so completely that you cannot rest, cannot simply be, cannot stop measuring your worth against external standards? The cage is most powerful, not when it constrains you through external force, but when it inhabits your consciousness so completely that you cannot imagine alternatives. When instrumental rationality becomes the only rationality you recognize, when efficiency becomes the only value you honor, when success becomes the only meaningful goal, then you've built the cage from the inside and locked yourself in without even noticing. But recognizing the cage is not the same as escaping it. And here we encounter the deepest challenge Weber identified. Even if you see clearly how instrumental rationality has colonized your existence, even if you recognize that your success is hollow and your productivity is purposeless, what do you actually do about it? You still have responsibilities. You still need income. You still live in a world structured by the very systems you're trying to resist. The cage is not something you can simply walk away from because it's everywhere. It's in the economy that determines your material survival. It's in the culture that shapes your sense of what's normal and possible. It's in the language you use to think about yourself and your world. It's in the very categories through which you understand what counts as a problem and what counts as a solution. This is why Weber's vision is often described as tragic. He saw clearly that modernity creates an iron cage, but he didn't believe there was a simple exit. The rationalized systems we've created are too powerful, too pervasive, too deeply embedded in every aspect of contemporary existence to be simply rejected or replaced. You cannot return to pre-modern forms of enchantment because those worldviews are no longer available to people who have passed through Enlightenment rationality. You cannot escape into pure charismatic spontaneity because charisma cannot sustain complex modern societies. You cannot pretend the cage doesn't exist because intellectual integrity demands that you face reality as it is. What remains is the possibility of conscious resistance, of maintaining spaces within yourself that refuse to be rationalized, of honoring values that cannot be measured, of choosing meaning over optimization even when it costs you, of building what Weber called an inner sanctuary that the cage cannot penetrate. This inner sanctuary is not escapism. It's not pretending that the external world doesn't matter, or that you can simply opt out of modernity. It's the recognition that you are more than your function within rationalized systems, that your worth exceeds your productivity, that there are dimensions of your existence that legitimately refuse instrumental purposes. Building this sanctuary requires discipline, which Weber understood deeply. It requires repeatedly choosing value rationality in a world that relentlessly pushes instrumental rationality. It requires saying no to opportunities that would increase your success but diminish your soul. It requires carving out time, space and attention for what matters most even when there's no measurable return on investment. It requires being willing to appear inefficient, impractical, even irrational by the standards of the cage because you're operating according to different standards you've chosen because they honor what you believe is sacred. Weber identified 3 specific traps that prevent people from achieving even this limited freedom. The first trap is what we might call the inflation of expertise. In highly rationalized systems, people develop tremendous competence in narrow domains. You become an expert in your field, a specialist in your function, a master of your particular role within the machine. This expertise brings rewards and recognition, and you begin to identify yourself entirely with your specialized knowledge. You become the role you perform. Your sense of worth becomes entirely dependent on your professional competence. When this happens, you've lost the ability to step back and ask whether your specialized knowledge is serving any purpose beyond its own perpetuation. You can optimize processes with extraordinary skill, but you cannot ask whether those processes should exist at all. You've become what Weber called a specialist without spirit, so absorbed in the technical details of your domain that you've lost sight of any larger questions about meaning or purpose. The second trap is what we might call the pleasure treadmill. When people recognize that instrumental rationality leaves them empty, they often try to compensate through consumption and experience. They work hard to earn money to buy things and take trips that provide temporary pleasure and distraction from the emptiness of their work. But this just creates a vicious cycle. You work jobs you find meaningless to afford lifestyles that don't actually satisfy you. Then you need to work more to afford more consumption to fill the void that the meaningless work creates. Weber saw that modern capitalism doesn't just trap you in production, it traps you in consumption. You become what he called a sensualist without heart, chasing pleasure after pleasure, experience after experience, never finding lasting satisfaction because you're still operating within the logic of instrumental rationality. You're still treating life as a problem to be solved through the right formula, the right purchase, the right vacation, when the problem is the instrumental orientation itself. The third trap is what we might call the paralysis of seeing. Some people recognize the iron cage with such clarity that they become overwhelmed by the impossibility of escape. They see how pervasive the rationalization is. They understand how deeply the instrumental logic has penetrated. They recognize that even their resistance is often just another form of optimization, another attempt to achieve the right lifestyle, the right level of consciousness, the right performance of awakening. This clarity, instead of leading to freedom, leads to cynicism and resignation. They see the cage so clearly that they cannot imagine anything beyond it. They become what Weber might call enlightened prisoners, fully aware of their confinement, but convinced that awareness changes nothing. This is perhaps the most dangerous trap, because it mistakes understanding for wisdom, diagnosis for cure, seeing the problem for solving it. Breaking free from these traps requires what Weber would call vocation in its deepest sense. Vocation is not your career. It's not your job title. It's not even necessarily related to your employment. Vocation is the thing you are called to do or be, regardless of whether it's rewarded, recognized, or even remotely practical. It's the value you serve because you cannot help but serve it. The commitment you honor because honoring it is who you are. The work you do because not doing it would mean betraying something essential in yourself. Vocation in this sense is the opposite of the iron cage because it emerges from value rationality rather than instrumental rationality. You don't choose your vocation because it will make you successful, though it might. You don't pursue it because it's efficient, though it may be. You commit to it because you recognize it as sacred, as intrinsically worthy, as the organizing principle of a meaningful life. Weber saw vocation most clearly in his famous lectures on science and politics as vocations. He was speaking to young people trying to figure out what to do with their lives in a disenchanted world. He told them that both science and politics, when pursued as genuine vocations, require enormous sacrifice. They demand that you give your life to work that may never be recognized, that will certainly never be completed, that might prove completely futile. Scientific research could be made obsolete by the next discovery. Political work could be destroyed by forces beyond your control. And yet, Weber argued, if you feel called to this work, you must pursue it anyway, not because it guarantees success, but because it's your vocation. The person who pursues science or politics for instrumental reasons for career advancement or status or power, will inevitably be disappointed and probably destructive. But the person who pursues it as a vocation, who does it because they must, who sacrifices for it not grudgingly but gladly because the work itself is sacred to them, that person achieves something the cage cannot give them. They achieve meaning. This brings us to what might be Weber's most important insight about the iron cage. The cage cannot be destroyed, but it can be inhabited consciously rather than unconsciously. You can perform your role within rationalized systems while maintaining awareness that you are not your role, that you exist in dimensions the system cannot capture, that you serve values the system cannot measure. This is what Weber meant by tragic consciousness. You live in a disenchanted world with full awareness of its disenchantment, but you refuse to become disenchanted yourself. You work within bureaucratic structures with full knowledge of their soullessness, but you refuse to let them colonize your soul. You participate in capitalist economies with complete understanding of their meaninglessness, but you refuse to let them define what has meaning for you. This is not easy. It requires constant vigilance, constant choosing, constant resistance to the seductive promise that if you just optimize a little more, the cage will set you free. The maintenance of inner freedom within external constraint demands specific practices that Weber implied, though he never systematically outlined them. The first practice is regular solitude. You need time completely outside the systems, the demands, the measurements, the performances that structure ordinary life. Not solitude for productivity, not retreat to return refreshed to your work, but time that serves no purpose beyond being. Time where you reconnect with the dimension of yourself that exists prior to all your roles and functions. This is harder than it sounds in a world that treats every moment as an opportunity for optimization. Unproductive solitude feels like waste, like inefficiency, like failure to maximize your potential. But that feeling is precisely the voice of the cage, and learning to resist it is essential to maintaining your humanity. The second practice is cultivating relationships that honor your being rather than your doing. Most of your relationships within rationalized systems are functional. People relate to you as the role you perform, the service you provide, the value you add. These relationships are necessary, but if they're all you have, you'll eventually lose contact with the part of yourself that exists beyond function. You need relationships where you're loved, not for what you achieve, but for who you are, where you can be completely non-productive and still be valued, where you don't have to perform or optimize or justify your existence. These relationships are forms of resistance against the cage, because they affirm that human worth cannot be reduced to instrumental purposes. The third practice is engaging with art, literature, music, or spiritual traditions that point toward dimensions of existence the cage cannot rationalize. Weber understood that art and religion preserve experiences of the sacred, the transcendent, the meaningful in itself, even in an age of disenchantment. When you encounter genuine art, not entertainment designed to distract you, but art that confronts you with beauty, tragedy, or mystery, you experience something that cannot be measured, optimized, or instrumentalized. That experience reminds you that reality exceeds rationalization, that there are dimensions of being that resist calculation, that the cage, however powerful, does not encompass everything. The fourth practice is making choices that honor value rationality, even when they conflict with instrumental rationality. This means sometimes choosing the less efficient path because it's the more meaningful one. Sometimes choosing less money because the work aligns with your values. Sometimes choosing less success because the cost to your integrity is too high. Every such choice is a small act of resistance against the cage, an affirmation that you are not entirely subject to its logic, a practice of freedom in the midst of constraint. These choices won't destroy the cage, but they maintain something within you that the cage cannot touch. Yet even these practices face a danger that Weber understood with painful clarity. There's always a risk that your resistance becomes just another form of performance, another role you're playing, another way of optimizing your existence. You can turn solitude into a productivity technique. You can instrumentalize your relationships by treating them as self-care. You can consume art as cultural capital. You can make value-rational choices because you've calculated that they'll bring you more authentic success. This is how insidious the cage is. It absorbs even your resistance, turning your rebellion into just another strategy for optimization. The only defense against this is ruthless self-honesty about your motivations and constant vigilance against the ways instrumental rationality creeps back in even when you're trying to resist it. Now we must face the question that Weber never fully answered, but that he knew was inescapable. If the iron cage is so pervasive, if instrumental rationality has colonized so completely, if even resistance can be absorbed into the system, then what genuine hope exists? Is inner freedom really possible? Or is it just a comforting illusion we tell ourselves to make the cage bearable? Weber's honesty forces us to acknowledge that he couldn't guarantee any answers. He saw the trajectory of modernity moving toward ever greater rationalization, ever more comprehensive bureaucratization, ever deeper disenchantment. He famously worried that we might end up in a polar night of icy darkness, a world so completely rationalized that even the possibility of meaning would be extinguished. But he also saw that history is not deterministic, that human beings can make choices that redirect the trajectory, that awareness itself changes what's possible. This is why Weber insisted that his sociology was value-free in its analysis but not in its purpose. He wasn't trying to tell you what to value. He was trying to make you conscious of the values you're already living by, often without knowing it, so that you could choose consciously rather than drift unconsciously. When you recognize that you've been organizing your entire existence around instrumental rationality, treating yourself as human capital to be optimized, you gain the power to ask whether that's really how you want to live. The answer might still be yes. You might decide that success within the existing systems is what matters most to you, but at least it would be a conscious choice, rather than an unexamined assumption. And for those who choose differently, who recognize that they cannot live entirely by instrumental logic without betraying something essential in themselves, awareness creates the space to begin constructing a life organized around different principles. If you've been listening and recognizing yourself in this description of the iron cage, if you feel the weight of instrumental rationality pressing on every aspect of your existence, if you sense that you're succeeding by all external measures while dying by all internal ones, then you're experiencing what Weber called the pain of consciousness. This pain is not a symptom to be cured. It's a sign that you haven't been completely absorbed into the cage, that something in you still recognizes the difference between optimization and meaning, between success and fulfillment, between functioning and flourishing. That recognition is precious even though it hurts. It's the beginning of freedom, not because it allows you to escape the external structures, but because it allows you to maintain an inner space those structures cannot colonize. The path forward is not escape, but conscious inhabitation. You live in the cage. That's the reality of modernity. But you can live in it consciously rather than unconsciously, critically rather than complacently, with value rationality, preserving spaces that instrumental rationality cannot touch. You can perform your roles within bureaucratic systems while maintaining awareness that you are more than your roles. You can participate in market economies while refusing to let market logic define your worth. You can use rationalized tools while remembering that tools should serve human purposes rather than humans serving tool purposes. This is what Weber meant by personality. Not a fixed essence but an ongoing achievement. A constant choosing to organize your life around values you believe are sacred, rather than drifting along the path of least resistance that the systems provide. And here we arrive at something Weber hinted at, but perhaps could not fully articulate because he was too embedded in the very rationalization he analyzed. The iron cage is not just external. It exists because we collectively create it through millions of individual choices to prioritize efficiency over meaning, optimization over value, instrumental rationality over value rationality, which means the cage can potentially be transformed through millions of individual choices in the opposite direction. When you choose meaning over optimization in your own life, you're not just achieving personal freedom. You're weakening the cage's hold on collective consciousness. When you refuse to measure your worth through productivity metrics, you're challenging the entire system that reduces human beings to human capital. When you honor values that cannot be measured, you're affirming that reality exceeds calculation. Your individual resistance may seem insignificant against the vast machinery of modern rationalization, but Weber understood that historical transformations begin with individuals who refuse to accept that what is must be, who insist that different ways of being are possible, even when the entire system says otherwise. This is why Weber's lectures on vocation were fundamentally political, even though they often sound individualistic. When he told young people to find their calling and pursue it, regardless of whether it brought success, he was not just offering personal advice. He was identifying the mechanism through which historical change happens. Systems change when enough individuals committed to different values create enough friction, enough resistance, enough alternative possibilities that the system can no longer absorb them. The Protestant Reformation didn't happen because Luther had a good strategy for institutional reform. It happened because Luther could not in good conscience continue living by values he no longer believed in, and his individual refusal inspired others to similar refusals until the entire religious structure of Europe was transformed. The civil rights movement didn't succeed through perfect planning. It succeeded because individuals refused to accept that racial oppression was inevitable, and their refusal became collective, and that collective refusal changed what was possible. So when you feel the pain of waking up inside the iron cage, when you recognize how completely instrumental rationality has colonized your existence, you face a choice that Weber knew was unavoidable. You can accommodate yourself to the cage, finding whatever comfort and success you can within its logic. You can become cynical about it, seeing clearly but doing nothing. Or you can commit yourself to living differently, honoring values that resist rationalization, creating spaces where meaning matters more than efficiency, accepting that this commitment will cost you, that you'll be seen as impractical or naive or inefficient, but knowing that this is the price of remaining human in a world that wants to reduce you to a function. The cage is real. Weber was not exaggerating its power or its pervasiveness. But the cage exists because we build it, which means we can choose to build differently. Not easily, not quickly, not through individual heroism or spiritual bypassing or naive rejection of complexity, but through the patient, difficult, ongoing work of maintaining consciousness in a world that demands unconsciousness, honoring value in a world that recognizes only price, choosing meaning in a world that offers only optimization. This work will not destroy the iron cage in your lifetime. It may not even weaken it noticeably, but it will preserve something essential within you and potentially within the culture, something that insists reality exceeds rationalization, that human beings are more than their functions, that life should be lived and not merely managed. If you found yourself in this exploration of Weber and the iron cage, if you recognized your own struggles with meaninglessness and instrumental rationality, I want you to know that this channel exists as a space for exactly these kinds of deep reflections on spirituality, meaning, and the challenges of living consciously in modernity. Every week I create content that explores these territories, drawing on thinkers like Weber but always connecting their insights to your actual lived experience. Subscribing means you won't miss these conversations, and more importantly, it means you're joining a community of people who refuse to accept that success and optimization are all there is, who are searching for genuine meaning even when the entire world tells them that search is impractical. Your participation matters. Your reflections in the comments matter, because this work of consciousness is not something we can do alone. And speaking of consciousness, I want to ask you something directly. When you think about your own life right now, which part of the iron cage feels most suffocating to you? Is it the workplace that treats you as human capital? Is it the productivity culture that won't let you rest? Is it the feeling that even your resistance has been absorbed into optimization? Whatever it is, write in the comments, I recognize the cage in my work, or I recognize the cage in my relationships, or I recognize the cage in my own mind. Your sharing helps others feel less alone in this struggle, and it helps me understand what you need from this channel. If you want to go deeper into Weber's thought, particularly his understanding of vocation and how to find meaningful work in a disenchanted world, you need to watch my video on the Protestant ethic and the spiritual crisis of modern achievement, where I reveal how Weber traced the psychological roots of our productivity addiction and what he believed was the only path to authentic calling in a rationalized world. That video builds directly on what we've explored here and offers practical frameworks for recognizing your genuine vocation amid all the noise. Thank you for taking this journey with me into the iron cage and the possibilities of conscious resistance. Keep questioning, keep choosing, keep refusing to let the systems define your worth. I'll see you in the next reflection, where we continue this essential work of maintaining meaning in a world that insists everything is merely mechanical. Until then, stay conscious in the cage.